This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 147 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about why white students need multicultural and social justice education. Since I recorded the last episode, the news has shifted from nonstop coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic to the worldwide response to the murder of George Floyd. I've seen more people post about racial justice in the past week than I've seen probably in the last 5 years. And while this is encouraging, I think a lot of people are holding their breath waiting to see what comes next. What happens after the protests are over, after the fire on social media dies down? There has always been so much work to do, and while many have always known this, some are just discovering it this week. I hope all of those who are posting about it now can continue to find ways to take action. This episode is about just one of those ways. The episode happened to already be in the works for months before recent events pushed racial justice into the forefront of every news and social media outlet, but it has become far more relevant now. And in its original form, it didn't quite rise to the occasion. Initially, it was going to be solely about why white students need multicultural education. But over the last week or so, the topic has shifted to include social justice education as well. My guest is Dr. Sheldon Eakins. Dr. Eakins is the founder of the Leading Equity Center, an online platform where he provides resources for classroom teachers who are committed to ensuring equity for their students, including online courses and his podcast, the Leading Equity Podcast. I strongly urge you to go and visit his podcast so that you can delve more deeply into all the topics he and his guests explore. Today, Dr. Eakins will talk with me about why white students need multicultural and social justice education, and then we'll get into more specifics about what topics are important to cover in that work. Over on the website, he has written a guest post on this same topic, and the post contains dozens of links to excellent resources that can help you put this work into motion. To find that, go to cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 147. What we're not talking about today is the need for white teachers to educate themselves, the importance of speaking out on issues of racial justice, the problem with statements like all lives matter or objections to the protests that are happening all over the world. We're not covering all that because racial justice is a massive topic. Lots of people are already doing that work very well. And I believe one way to make progress is to give sufficient attention to smaller pieces of the larger problem so that people can take action on those. I do want to take one more minute, though, before we get started, to address something that tends to come up every now and then with some of my listeners and readers. Anytime I post about something remotely political or related to racial justice, I will typically get one or two emails from educators who are basically asking me to stay in my lane. They want me to keep posting about teaching strategies and about pedagogy, but avoid controversial topics like race. My response to that request is no. No, I will not stop writing about, researching, or exploring topics related to equity. If you're looking for a website or a podcast that only covers teaching strategies, you will have to look elsewhere. For me, equity and pedagogy cannot be separated. As educators, we are participants in one of the most extensive and well-established institutions for the management, conditioning, sorting, and separating of human beings. And in many, many schools, inequities are being perpetuated and reinforced every day. What I want is to see us do better and to know that our schools are full of teachers committed to doing just that. I have serious concerns about any teacher who doesn't want to hear about equity and racial justice. If you haven't had a change of heart by now, it is time to step aside so others can do the work. You should not be teaching, full stop. Now, before we get started, I need to thank the people who make it possible for me to put out this podcast. which is the sponsors. I would like to start by thanking ViewSonic. ViewSonic has been dedicated to being part of the educational community for over 30 years. They want to help the millions of teachers and students finding themselves trying to learn from home. They're currently offering free access to their MyViewBoard digital whiteboarding software, giving teachers all the distance learning tools they need to continue to conduct classes. Now, MyViewBoard includes new features released for distance learning. Check it out today and get access at myviewboard.com/distance-learning. myviewboard.com/distance-learning. Support also comes from PowerSchool. PowerSchool knows that teachers go above and beyond for students, but teachers need help too, especially as they're asked to do more every day. That's why PowerSchool, now with Schoology, combines SIS, LMS, and assessment technology, empowering teachers with more time for what really matters. Visit powerschool.com/timeforteachers to find out how teachers are using technology to unlock student success. That's powerschool.com/timeforteachers. Now, here is my interview with Sheldon Eakins. Hit this record now. Sheldon, welcome to the podcast.
Jennifer, thank you for having me.
It's funny because we have been talking about this for kind of a couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot has happened lately that has actually led us to the point where we've kind of reworked this topic that we're going to be talking about. And I feel like we've hopefully got it right. But let me just sort of scroll back a little bit and talk about I'm afraid that I'm going to forget to tell my listeners about your podcast because we're going to get into all the details. But since we're recording right now, I want to let everybody listening know that you have got an excellent podcast called Leading Equity. And it goes into way more depth on so many of the other topics that are related to the one we're going to talk about today. So I would just want to commend you too, because you do such a professional job on that podcast and you cover such really good stuff in depth. So I wanted to just start off with a big compliment.
Well, thank you. That means a lot coming from you. So I appreciate that.
So let's just start by having you tell us a little bit about your education background and your current role. And if you can sort of relate it to this topic, even better.
Sure. So my education background, I have a bachelor's degree in social science education, a master's in ed leadership, and then a PhD in K through 12 education. What's interesting is how I kind of got into this work. It was like, I'd been doing this work, but I didn't know what it was called. I had never heard of the term equity or social justice, those kind of things. I mean, I just had this, always been compelled to help people, help others. And as I would look around, I would see people not having opportunities. And it was just something that's always been passionate for me. I mean, I was a school principal of a private school. And, our school was situated in a neighborhood that was basically a Black neighborhood. And I mean, a lot of the kids that were surrounding the neighborhood, I mean, they weren't able to attend the school. And so that was important to me. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to apply for it was called a voucher in Louisiana, where we were able to support students who were, coming from schools. And it was actually cheaper for the state to pay for the tuition of my school than it was for them to send them to public school. And so we were able to provide, I think it was 50 seats for students that were in the community and were able to come to the school. So again, I have been doing this work for years. I just didn't know what it was called. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm okay, equity. Oh, that's what this is. And it's like, oh, okay. So now that I've learned what it was, then I've been able to do more research on it and just kind of stumbled across it. And so that's what I do. In addition to running the Leading Equity Center and hosting the Leading Equity podcast, I'm also a special education director. I work on a Native American reservation here in Idaho. I enjoy what I do. It's definitely has been interesting with COVID-19 impacting the way that we do school. But man, I just truly enjoy what I do.
Fantastic. So, a lot has happened. We're recording this on June 5th, 2020, and a lot has happened in about the last 10 days or so that has really brought the topic of racial justice right up to the forefront in the minds of a lot more people then normally pay attention to it. I guess that's the best way of putting it, because it's
Mm-hmm.
been front of mind for a lot of other people, but suddenly it's on everyone's mind now. And so it, let's rewind a little and talk to me about what originally made you want to write this guest post for me on multicultural education and social justice education for white students. And then we can talk a little bit about how kind of both of our thinking has changed about the approach in the last 10 days.
And you're right. I mean, it's funny because we've been communicating for a while, and initially when I reached out to you, I was like, Jennifer, I do this training that I do on multicultural education, and it's primarily for our schools that have predominantly white students, and that all came from a conversation that I had with a school principal who, I think they participated in my Leading Equity Virtual Summit that occurred back in January. And she was saying, I really enjoyed your sessions that you had, the guests that you had. Some of it I felt was relevant, but to be honest, I mean, we're 90% white at our school. And, I just didn't think a lot of that stuff didn't really matter to us, or it just didn't fit what we have as far as our demographics.
Mm-hmm.
It really got me thinking. 'Cause I'm like, wait a second. So you're telling me that multicultural education, equity, diversity, inclusion, these kind of things aren't important to you as a school leader who, in my opinion, school leaders are the chief diversity officers. Okay. They're the ones who have the control, who have the power, and they're the ones who, can allocate financial resources to support various causes. So if I'm listening to a school leader who's telling me, well, we have, pretty much all white students at our school, and so therefore, these things aren't relevant to us. That was like that moment. I was like, okay, so how can I educate others? So I took some time to provide a teachable moment, and that was kind of the premise behind this training that I started to do. And because I felt like it was important, I'm like, you can't be the only person that feels that way. I have to wonder about your teachers and maybe what their thoughts are on, should we talk about diversity? Should we talk about bringing different perspectives and culture and all these things? Because, there's just pretty much all white people at our school. So that's kind of why I reached out to you and I said, I want to share this with you, just like I've been sharing with others.
Yeah. It's funny, when I first when we first started talking about this, it reminded me of when I used to work with student teachers, and they had to prepare a massive unit plan. And one of the questions they had to answer early on was, how are you going to be addressing, I can't remember how it was worded, but it was basically issues of diversity. And the number of my students who said, this is not an issue in my school because all of my students are white. And I remember having that same reaction. It was just like, wait, whoa, your kids might need it more than anybody. So
right.
It was, and there were no resources really to point them towards. So I'm glad that we're doing this and that you're writing this post, because there's something targeted to this specific topic.
But so the thing about it is, so that was my initial reaching out to you, right? But like we said, over the last 10 days or so, maybe even before that, Ahmaud Arbery was killed. Then we're talking about George Floyd, Christian Cooper. There's a Breonna Taylor. There's all and other names, right? And so then it was like, okay, dealing with the time of when this blog will come out, when this podcast will come out, we need to shift our focus. We need to, yes, it's important that we talk about multicultural education, but it's also important that we talk about social justice education. Yes. And so that's why I was like, and I'm glad you and I just kind of been open to having these conversations and be like, okay, we need to really hone in on what educators' role is when it comes to dealing with current events that impact our students. If we have Black kids in our classroom and we aren't saying anything or doing anything to help our students, or if we have white students in our classroom and we're not saying anything or teaching them anything, then we're doing a disservice to our communities.
Right. So let's just go ahead and make sure everybody listening understands the difference between multicultural education and social justice education. What's the difference between those for you?
For me, multicultural education is providing if you will, a story. And I'm a history guy, so I might be a little biased, but we can go beyond just history, right? We can,
Mm-hmm.
any subject has a story, whether if it's math, science, PE, there's some sort of a story that we can share.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, when it comes to education, our traditional practices are colonially based, meaning
Mm-hmm.
they're often put in from a white perspective. So with
Mm-hmm.
multicultural education, there's a framework involved where you can provide multiple perspectives. If we're looking at, okay, well, how were Black people impacted during this, or what or people, just people of color in general, or just things from different lenses as opposed to the traditional dominant culture of white people providing this information. So that's the multicultural piece, but we can go beyond that, and that's where that social justice comes in, right? Where it's like, oh man, I've learned that people are being mistreated, or you know what, I'm reading my textbook, or I'm looking at this content, or I'm looking at the pictures on the walls in my teacher's classroom, and I'm not seeing diversity there. I'm not seeing much beyond, I want to learn more. And or you know what, some of the things that are occurring, especially even if we're talking about like what's happening right now with protests and police brutality, how can I get involved rather than me being a quote unquote bystander and just kind of, I'm not actively participating in these discrimination and racism. I'm not doing those things. I'm not wearing a hood on my, a white hood on. So
Right.
that's not me. Right.
Yeah.
But I'm not doing anything else. I'm not going to say anything, that doesn't impact me, directly. So therefore, I'm not going to do anything about it. So that's that social justice piece, is how can we get our kids involved? Because we have to consider that our generation that we're raising, as far as the student population currently, are future governors, or future law, Congress people, lawyers, and people of influence that we're impressing, that we're spending time with majority of the day with. And what can we do as educators to help them change the mindset that a lot of things that are coming from their homes, we have influence as well. And I think that's that social justice piece.
Right. Right. I also just want to, before we start to get into this a little bit more, I want to acknowledge that there are so many other things to talk about
Mm-hmm.
that are just on the periphery of this, like why teachers should be speaking out more in public. And also, we're kind of coming from the perspective right now that the teachers themselves have already done their own work and their own self-education.
Mm-hmm.
That's also a kind of a separate topic.
That's a whole nother
Um,
podcast.
Right, exactly. And we can't necessarily cover everything here. So we're just going to take one slice of this pie and basically just talk about how we might educate our white students. Um, so, in this post and everybody listening, Sheldon is also writing a guest post for Cult of Pedagogy that outlines this stuff too. And there's going to be a ton of resource links, or links out to other resources that expand on all of these and give you things that you can use with your students. But one of the first things you sort of cover is why are multicultural and social justice education relevant for white students? And you gave us three main reasons. So let's get into those.
Whiteness is complex, right? So the idea of whiteness is complex. How many times have I heard someone say, well, I don't have culture because I'm white, or there's that assumption that when we talk about culture, we're talking about race and
Mm,
ethnicity. But within the white culture, there's different religions, there's languages, there's disabilities, there's sexual orientation, there's identity.
mhm,
So whiteness is not a homogenous thing. It's actually heterogeneous, right? There's
mhm,
different characteristics that are in place. So to me, that's the first part, is we need to help our students understand, just because you're white doesn't mean that you don't have any culture. I mean, your ancestors at some point, you came to the United States, right? And so
mm,
uh they came from Italy, they came, from Europe. So all these different countries, they had religion, they had their language, their customs and practices. And a lot of that stuff has been lost. it can be retrieved, but
Mm.
those things aren't necessarily always celebrated or participating at home and outside. So, when we think about how race was kind of constructed, because it's not nothing biological, it's a social construct. So we could go all the way back to the 1790s when the U.S. Census was first done, which was basically a way to create this social hierarchy
Mm.
and say, you know what, we can determine based off of your quote unquote race who gets the right jobs, who has the ability to vote or marry or own property. Those things were all kind of created, and so they have over time continued to be a way to separate through white supremacy basically who gets this power, and that has continued to perpetuate throughout time. And so now we're in these moments where just the whole fact of Black Lives Matter is so quote unquote controversial. Like,
Mm.
we have to really sit here and argue with you that we matter. Like,
Mhm.
how is that even an issue, that whether or not we matter?
And that actually sort of leads us to, the second reason why, once white students understand the complexity of their own backgrounds and that it's not just this homogenous thing and that race is sort of this artificial construct because we all come from a variety of different kinds of backgrounds. Um, what's the second reason why this kind of education is good for white students?
Multicultural literacy is a separate and necessary literacy. I'll paraphrase a little bit about what Dr. Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, says. Basically, that historically, a lot of white people haven't been able to see anything beyond, they're racially illiterate, is basically what she says, where
Mhm.
they're not necessarily thinking about things that are outside of their race because they don't impact them. They don't, I haven't personally had to deal with these kind of issues, or I haven't personally felt like I was being discriminated against. So I don't necessarily see these things happening because it hasn't impacted me, basically.
It's interesting because, the more I personally plug into paying more attention to racial equity, I'm finding that my own vocabulary is changing, and I'm learning more in terms of just new ideas, new terms, and also that the sort of language that is most acceptable now for talking about these issues. There's, it evolves over time, and I think if you're not plugged in and you're not paying attention, you can end up really stepping in it in terms of using language that's offensive to people. So I feel like that concept of literacy on these issues is very broad. And, in order for our kids to participate in this, they need to have that literacy, both in terms of their awareness and in terms of the language that they use.
Jennifer, I've had so many white educators reach out to me, especially during these times, most recently. Number one, to check in to see how I'm doing. And then
Mm.
number two, to ask me, I know this is wrong. I just don't know what to say.
Hmm.
Or they'll say, you know what, I've said things in the past, but maybe I didn't say it, like you were saying, my vocabulary wasn't correct.
Yeah.
Or somehow I didn't word it the way I should have worded it. And I got, people jumped on me and social
Right.
media attacked me. I felt attacked. And so therefore I know, again, now we're talking about what's happening right now. And it's like, I want to say something, but I remember the last time I tried to say something and it didn't go well. So
Yeah.
I do agree, like that literacy piece is so important because, if we aren't confident in our language or
Mm.
what to say, then we remain silent, right? We don't know what to say, so I just won't say anything. But
Yes.
these are the times where we have to say stuff, right? This is a time where we need to speak up and we need to all speak out. So just because I'm not a black person doesn't mean I need to be quiet because, well, I'm afraid what repercussions I'm going to get if I don't say things the right way.
Yeah. And that is a big fear for white people. And one thing that I have discovered is when you stumble and you get jumped on, then you realize you come through that
Hmm.
and you survive and you can do it again and you can maybe do it a little better the next time. And not being quite as afraid of that process, I think only comes from trying it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And it's teachable moments. It's learning is an opportunity for us to grow, and to really educate ourselves. Just reaching out to a person of color and asking them, hey, what do I say? Is not enough. You need to educate yourself as well. And, the onus is on us to be able
Yeah.
to communicate properly.
Right, right. Speaking of not doing enough, that actually was the third reason why it's important for us to be educating our white students. So, what is that third reason?
I read your mind, Jennifer. See, we're connected
Yeah.
there. I know. So it's fun. It's interesting. So, what we've been doing is not enough, right? So we sit here and we, some of us as teachers, we provide information from various cultures. And, a lot of times, to be honest, I mean, this is something that Dr. James A. Banks, who is the considered the founder of multicultural education, he talks about how a lot of us use this, contribution approach, which is basically, we'll teach a lesson and then we'll say, well, by the way, this person of color did this, or this person, here's some science from George Washington Carver, and so we'll do just a special contribution. So it's still taught from a white perspective with a little bit of sprinkled in a little bit of contributions here, he also talks about the additive approach, which is, okay, we'll go a little bit further than just the by the way part. What we'll talk about now is we'll teach a whole lesson. So let's say the Lewis and Clark expedition, and honestly, that was a reconnaissance mission. We call it an expedition, but that's clearly a way for them to scope out the land and see how they can take this land. Which again, that could be a whole nother podcast as well. But they sought out this, so what they'll do is they'll teach about Lewis and Clark, and then they'll provide a whole unit or a whole lesson all dedicated to Sacagawea. So that's the additive approach, but it's still taught from a white perspective with a little bit of here and there. So if we're saying, you know what, I'm being culturally responsive because I taught a whole unit on a person of color, and so now I'm being culturally responsive, that's not enough. That's not the way that we should go, because we're still teaching from a white perspective as a primary piece of the content, and then we're adding in or we're contributing with other little pieces here and there, which in turn continues the hierarchy of white supremacy. Now we still have people that are calling police officers to use them as weapons on Black people.
Yes.
Right. We just talked about Christian Cooper earlier on in our conversation. This man is bird watching, minding his own business. He sees a white woman that is walking around with a dog with no leash on. And if you're not familiar with the story, I mean, hopefully you've heard of it by now.
Google Amy Cooper. Yeah, it's everywhere. and it's such a gross video.
And she literally says, I'm going to call the police to tell them that an African American is threatening me and my dog.
Yep.
Utilizing the police as a weapon. So that's why what we're doing is not enough. We have to go beyond just, oh, by the way, or here, let me teach a whole week. We're going to dedicate a whole week to some culture. No, it needs to be embedded. It can't be sprinkled in. It has to be included as a whole, as multiple perspectives. And then again, adding in the social justice piece. What kind of action can we take based off of what we learned? That's the way we need to be going.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to get into next. We're going to start to actually dig into the content. What would this multicultural and social justice education look like? And we sort of have it broken down into 5 kind of subsections or 5 areas. So let's get into that. What would be these sort of 5 different areas that would be important to teach in this kind of education to white students?
So the first step is we have to help our white students understand their own culture and ethnic background. So again, I'm a big proponent of anything that we're going to teach someone. It starts with us first, right? And so again, we're assuming that the teacher has already recognized the importance of talking about this, the importance of providing a multicultural perspective. And then from there, they're teaching their students the same thing. okay, we have to go beyond the idea of, oh, I'm just white. Okay. I don't have a culture. No, we need to teach them about their own culture, their own ethnic backgrounds, and help them understand where they're coming from so that they can understand why the benefits that they have had because of privilege and because of the way racial hierarchies, which again, it's something that was created, and that impact how it oppresses other people. So we have to help them understand their own culture and ethnic background. So when we start thinking about, okay, all right, so we can help our white students understand a little bit about their ancestry and kind of go back to what traditions and cultures and languages were utilized in their homes and their communities, and then we can from there talk about, okay, now that you recognize maybe back in when people first started coming to the United States, there was actually discrimination amongst each other where certain like Italians and our Irish folks were mistreated by each other, right? And so understanding that and how maybe your ancestors might have been mistreated may help you understand why people of color are experiencing what they're experiencing and why we're upset because these experiences are happening to us. Not to say, and I don't want this to be confused as I'm trying to compare the experiences of white people versus the experiences of people of color. So I want to be clear about that. What I'm saying is, if you can because if things don't personally happen to you, sometimes we don't always think about it, and sometimes, to be honest, we don't care. So if you can at least be able to relate in some sense why discrimination is wrong, and maybe how some of your people, your ancestors, were either being discriminated against or were discriminating others, then maybe you can kind of see a little bit why this is so important. And so just being able to relate that. The second part is we need to help them to understand, or sorry, they need to be studying everyday language. Okay. What are some of the terms, some of the words that we utilize on a daily basis that actually have negative connotations behind them? I remember when I was younger and the movie Malcolm X came out, and I remember watching the movie directed by Spike Lee. And there's a scene where Denzel Washington he's playing Malcolm X, and he's in the process of converting over to Islam. And one of the prisoners hands him a dictionary and shows him, okay, here's all the words associated with white, lightness and purity, and all these words that he's seeing. And then he said, okay, let's look at the word black. What do you see with black? And there's blackballed, there's darkness, there's evil, and all these associations with the definition of black and white, right? So just from that language, I mean, we utilize these words all the time. We say blackmail, we say blackballed, and say blacklisted versus white labeled or whitelisted, and how those words mean differently. Okay. In addition to that, we have to also consider how language can bring in those implicit biases that we have. So if you're not familiar with what implicit bias means, it's basically I'm not thinking about things, but I have maybe a stereotype that has played into my mind. And so therefore it has made, I'm making a judgment or a perception based off of maybe limited to no experience or knowledge, but I'm making my judgments or perceptions based off of that. So that's the other piece. In addition to the language, is how our biases impact, or our attitudes impact the way that we, perceive, the news that we watch. If we might have a certain political view, so maybe we watch CNN, and maybe we watch Fox News, because maybe what the commentators or the news analysts are saying validate our own thoughts that we may have in regards to other communities outside of our own. The third piece is examining representation in our curriculum and beyond. And again, this is kind of tied into that social justice piece as well, because, I remember I'll tell you a quick story. I was a principal, and I was subbing for my science teacher, and we were reading a science book. And we let's see, we turned the page, and literally every person in the picture of the science book was a black person. And I remember sitting in the class as I'm leading this class and I'm subbing for one of my teachers. We didn't have any other subs at the time, so I had to jump in there and be in the classroom. And one of the students says, "Mr. Eakins, how come all the students in this page are black?" And you should have seen the like a pin could have dropped, and it was just silence across the classroom. And shoot, even my jaw opens up like, "Are you serious right now?" So I said, okay. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this is a teachable moment here. Rather than me naturally wanting to respond or react in a way because of this microaggression I just received when a student is asking me, how come all the pictures are black? I said, well, okay, well, let's turn the page and turn the next page. Turn the next page. Turn the next page. What do you see? Who's in there? White people. So because you're used to seeing people that look like you on a regular basis, it threw you off to where you literally asked, well, what? Wait, well, how come I'm not on this picture? I'm supposed to be here, right? How come I'm not here? So that's things that we have to teach our students, right? If they're and it's one of those things that, again, if it doesn't necessarily impact you, or if you're used to living a life where either you feel like everything belongs to you, or you're just used to seeing yourself represented in everything that you do, everywhere that you go, that you're thrown off, that there's something different. This is not like the other, one of those kind of situations.
Yeah.
So we have to make sure that we're helping our students challenge this. So if we're conscious as educators and we're saying, you know what, I recognize that my textbook that I currently have, or this curriculum that I currently have, is primarily focused on white culture, and I want to make sure that I'm bringing in various perspectives and I'm telling multiple stories. Like Chimamanda Adichie says in her TED Talk, I'm bringing in different perspectives. It's not just a single story. Then we can help our students be able to speak up as well. You know what? I went into Mr. Johnson's classroom and I say, Mr. Johnson, I would really appreciate seeing different cultures and learning more outside of my own culture as a white person and what I identify as all my identities. I see that I'm an able-bodied, straight person, and I would love to see different perspectives. And how is that being represented? It's not showing me a wide representation in this curriculum that you're providing me. We can have our students and help our students provide their own voices to advocate for this. But if we don't say anything, if we don't teach our students these things, then again, it's not providing the social justice piece, which is so important with the way that we do our pedagogy. The fourth one is understanding and recognizing privilege. Okay. And I know that this is a touchy subject for a lot of white people in regards to white privilege. And there's a lot of misunderstandings. I did a webinar on implicit bias, and I talked about privilege. And I remember one of the educators emailed me later on and said, you know what, I got to call you out on your bias because, I talked about in the webinar that we had several students who, you know what the subject was? We were talking about grading. And I was saying that grading is privilege. If we're grading during COVID-19 and we're doing online and we're grading, that's privilege, right? We're grading privilege. And he said, well, you know what, I got to call you out on that because you know what? I have a lot of students who actually don't have, they're not wealthy and, they don't make a lot of money. And so they don't have any privilege. And I had to explain to him, I said, listen, that's a myth. People assume, or there's a lot of people that think that privilege means that you have money, that you're well off, that you're affluent. No, there's all kind of privilege, right? There's, if I'm Christian, let's keep it real. If I'm Christian and I'm in school, and let's say if my neighbor is Muslim or atheist, that impacts them in school. There is religious privilege. There's male and there's gender privilege, right? There's racial privilege, and then there's white privilege. There's all kind of different privileges. So we have to help our students understand what type of privileges they have. Because again, going back to what Amy Cooper said, I'm going to call the cops and let them know that an African American man is threatening me and my dog. That's the privilege. She knew her privilege. She knew how black people are being treated with the police and police brutality. And this was before George Floyd, right? And so she knew that she could call the police officers to protect her against any black person that was gold for her. Right. And so that was her go-to method. So we have to teach our students about their privilege. The final one, ultimately, we have to help our students we have to teach them about dismantling racism. Okay. Now, Dr. Ibram Kendi, he has this book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I love this book. I actually have two copies. Of this book. He talks about there is no you're racist or not racist. There's no not racist, right? So if you say, you know what, again, I'm not burning crosses. I didn't say, I don't claim myself to be a skinhead, or I'm not part of the Aryan Nation, or calling myself a Nazi, none of those things. I'm not doing that. So therefore I'm good, right? That's not me. Mm-hmm. But what would you do if you saw someone being discriminated against based off of the color of their skin? Would you just walk away? Would you step in and help them out? Would you just say, would you send them a message later? Like my friend Kalisa Wing says, are you an ally in their DMs? Or are you going to actually go out and say, speak up against it? Or how can I use the privilege that I just learned about in step 4? How do I use that to help dismantle racism? Often I might have a seat at the table as a white person, and I'm in these meetings or committees, and I'm a part of these coalitions or groups that has influence when it comes to power and how systems are being created and how rules are being made. How can I use that privilege that I have to dismantle racism? We are developing student leaders in our classrooms, in our schools. How can we help our student leaders who are white use their voices to support the cause, to help dismantle? Let's make, we say, the Constitution talks about equality, right? All men are created equally, right? So how do we make sure that that's actually the case and not just words on the paper? And what can we do to work towards making sure that the cultures and the schools, the coloniality that has typically been our tradition of education, how do we decolonize what our schools look like by using our voice as white students? And that's the 5th part of the section.
You sort of have this sort of final paragraph about kindness versus the kind of teaching you're talking about. And so if you can just sort of share that final thought with us.
I had to give credit to Dr. Terry Watson. She was on my show, and the title of the episode was, kindness does not equal anti-racist. We have to go beyond teaching our kids to be kind to each other, right? We have to go beyond, we're not going to bully each other, and or we're going to treat everyone with respect and love, and we're going to just cherish it. We have to go beyond that, right? It's that activity. How do we actively respond to that, and how do we help others that we see are in need, and not be just sit there and just watch and just say, I didn't do it, I didn't participate in that, and so therefore I'm good. Right. Like Dr. Kendi says, there is no racist and not racist. I can't say I'm not racist. No, I need to be anti-racist, meaning I'm actively working to dismantle racism versus, well, I didn't wear the hood, or I'm not claiming to be a part of one of these white supremacist groups, so therefore I'm fine. But just because it doesn't personally impact you doesn't mean that you should not say or do anything about it.
Right. And one of the ways that all of the teachers listening can actively work against racism, be anti-racist, is to work to educate their white students. Mm-hmm. So I thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate you having me on your show.
I want to remind people that your podcast is Leading Equity. Anybody who likes my podcast and is really committed to these issues, you've got weeks and weeks of binge listening to Sheldon's podcast, Leading Equity, too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 147. To get a weekly email from me about my newest blog posts and podcast episodes, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.